Good afternoon and welcome to the Future of Finance. We have seen the future of securities and it's tokenised. I shall now pass you over to Dominic Hobson and the panel. Thank you.
Hello everybody, welcome to our webinar. We have seen the future of securities and it is tokenised. I'm Dominic Hobson, co-founder of Future of Finance, and I'm delighted to moderate our discussion today. Just 5 days ago, we were discussing the threat which tokenisation represents to central securities depositories. Today, we'll be asking what it means for security exchanges and trading platforms and the associated paraphernalia of investment banks, broker-dealers, asset managers, end investors, and custodian banks. After all, if some of the projections of the rapidity of the growth of the security token markets are fulfilled, tokenisation is a dagger aimed at the heart of all the businesses currently making a living out of the 100 trillion global equity markets and the 94 trillion global bond markets. But rather than simply add to the pile of grand claims that have been made, today we're going to focus on more down-to-earth issues and practicalities. What will persuade issuers to issue security tokens? What will persuade investors to invest in them? How can security tokens be made liquid? How can the security token markets attract liquidity? And of course, the plumbing issues, how security token transactions can be settled and custodied. Then at last, but far from least, of course, is laws and regulations. Are the right regimes in place to declare security tokens an institutional grade investment or not? To throw light on these and other issues, I'm joined by a group of experts on tokenization that are pioneering these exciting new developments. Damien Fontenille is Director of Business Development, Europe and North America at Tokenised Solutions, the Luxembourg-based provider of an issuance, transfer and settlement platform for tokenized securities. Michael Schorloff is CEO and co-founder at Fireblocks, the provider of an institutional-grade safe custody and settlement platform for digital assets that recently completed a $133 million fundraising that also saw BNY Mellon take a strategic stake in the firm. Mike Manning is Head of Business Development for the securitization platform at Symbiont, and they are a provider of an enterprise blockchain platform which offers users issuance, trading and shareholder registration services and asset servicing automation through smart contracts. Olaf Ransom is a payments and securities operations expert currently working with the SIX Digital Exchange, a regulated cryptocurrency and security token issuance, trading, settlement and custody platform built and operated by the Swiss Stock Exchange. Richard Crook is a director at Lab 577, a software company dedicated to using emerging technologies to cut costs, increase efficiency, and improve the customer experience at existing financial institutions. Simon Barnby is Chief Marketing Officer at Archax, the first FCA-regulated digital securities exchange, broker, and custodian based in London. Its services are aimed at institutions. As always, in addition to our panelists, we also have you, our audience. We want your questions, we want your comments, so please send them, keep sending them throughout this webinar via the Q&A functionality at the bottom of the screens. We will not be saving them up to the end, but we'll answer them as we go along, so you can be fully involved in this discussion right from the off. That's a vast subject, and we've only got an hour, so I'm going to begin by asking the panelists that we have from the tokenization platforms why they think security tokens are not just going to work, but to grow exponentially. After all, 30 years have now elapsed since the famous prediction in 1989 by the Harvard Business School professor Michael Jensen that we're witnessing the eclipse of the public corporation. That does actually seem to be happening now. The number of companies listed in London and New York has halved over the last 20 years. Now, hostile takeovers, private equity buyouts, and the takeover of stock market investing by index funds have all played a part in that. But my question is, can security tokens reverse that trend, perhaps by democratizing ownership of financial assets? Now, could I throw that question first at you, Damien? What gives you confidence that the security token markets are going to take off? You're on mute, Damien.
I mean, the security token are promised with an exponential growth. I shouldn't be on mute. You should be hearing me now.
We do. Although your connection may be a bit slow.
Okay, so security tokens are offered primarily on private securities, and you've witnessed over the last few years an exponential growth in private securities, be it on real estate, equity, private debt. And so the security tokens are sustaining this growth and are part as well of the digitization of processes for issuers. So I think beyond the security token itself, it's accompanying the growth of private markets as a whole.
And Olaf, what gives SDX confidence? You've heard Damien say that this is really focused on private assets, if you like, on the real estate, private equity, and the rest of it, which are kind of where you'd expect it to start. But can we look forward to the equity, the conventional equity and bond markets starting to get tokenized? We'll come later to whether existing outstanding issues need to be tokenized, but can we expect new issues where people previously would have gone to the Eurobond market or to the London Stock Exchange or New York Stock Exchange? Will these switch to being tokenized?
Yes, would be the simple part to that answer. I think the first question, the follow-up to that then says, well, where do those assets come from? And I think Damien was right, and they'll largely come from the private side. There'll be assets that hitherto haven't been available. So looking at what's moving around us at the moment, where we see interest, is that there are a lot of assets on banks' balance sheets that they're going to have to go and get rid of at some point, because the new Basel regulations are going to force them to do something. And by the same token, no pun intended, as we come out of the COVID era, there's going to be a bigger demand for capital, but the banks can't put it on their balance sheets. So I see that driver around Basel IV as being an initial big influence as to what happens. There is no compunction to do tokenization in any way, shape, or form. It's not mandatory. But dealing with some of the things that are on the agenda, like Basel IV, that is mandatory. And hopefully, if we do that in a smart way using the technology that's available, we do proverbially better, faster, cheaper, and make that more accessible.
Simon, what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I'd take maybe a little step back first and just kind of say that, you know, how kind of we at Archax see the world. I mean, if you look at capital markets, financial markets, they've been electronic for a long time, but they haven't really been truly digital. And if you look at other sectors, industry sectors, I mean, look at the music industry. You know, we all used to buy vinyl, then CDs, then we downloaded music, and now we're streaming it. You know, the content has stayed the same, but the way we consume it has completely changed, you know, brought about by a digital revolution. Same in retail, you know, kind of look at the high street and look at Amazon. You know, the sort of, you know, marketplaces have been revolutionized by digital. And as I say, in capital markets, I don't really think that's begun fully yet. They've been electronic, but not fully digital. And I think the benefits of, you know, DLT, blockchain, and tokenization are sort of twofold. I mean, on the one hand, you know, what we've been talking about, private companies, it's sort of opening up a way for them maybe to access capital and for people to invest and trade in them. And it's also allowing people to innovate and sort of tokenize interesting asset classes that are currently hard to trade or difficult to invest in, and democratizing them and opening them up to access. But also, I think, you know, if you look at traditional financial markets, although the trading is very electronic and fast, you know, what happens post-trade is a bit of a nightmare. It's quite manual. It's lots of intermediaries involved, lots of reconciliations taking place. And, you know, it's not going to happen overnight, but, you know, DLT technology has the potential to kind of sweep away a lot of that, you know, improve efficiencies, streamline processes and operations. So, you know, I think our view is from Archax, you know, we're kind of seeing the innovative end of the liquidity spectrum at the minute. But actually the potential is there over time, and it will take time because it has impacts on regulation to kind of revolutionize the way financial markets operate around the world, you know, the traditional financial markets operate.
Thanks, Simon. Michael, can I ask you to give us a perspective from a DeFi promontory, if you like, because DeFi means that tokenized financial products are being issued onto blockchains all the time right now. We just heard Simon say this won't happen overnight, but actually it is happening in that relatively small specialist market. What do you think the implications of what's happening in DeFi are for the tokenization of conventional securities? Are they pioneering what's going to happen in the securities markets, or are they some kind of threat to it with all their disintermediation possibilities?
Yeah, I guess the answer for that is both, right? I think that in some ways it is an interesting proof of concept, right, of the technology and how this technology works and the efficiencies, the liquidity, the access, right, and the, I guess, like, last but not least, the democratization that can happen to something that is being flowed in a fairly easy manner. There is also quite a few interesting things that you're seeing those days, that you sort of have more sophisticated tokens on DeFi that are doing some things that look exactly like corporate actions, right? We have all the ideas around the tokens can basically rebase themselves and things like that. As itself, clearly the regulation currently prevents from security tokens to basically propagate into DeFi, and just in general, the DeFi space is sort of has a very unclear regulatory statute. But I think that once, in my opinion, once we will actually be able to get security tokens into some level of mainstream, I think that they will actually follow the path of DeFi much faster than we think. And probably the market access and the market structure that we see around that, I believe that in some ways will leverage DeFi.
Mike, Simon used the examples of what's happened in the music industry and the telephone industry, and Michael has just said this could start to happen very quickly. And this is the thing about these digital technology; they can scale very quickly, indeed. But my question for you, Mike, is: do you expect there to be, in the end, a very small number of successful global security tokenization platforms, or would you expect this market to remain fragmented along national or asset class lines for quite a long time? Are we going to have a long period of chaos, or a short period of experimentation ending in a small number of winners, if you like, which could be among which could be the people on the panel today?
Well, we certainly all hope. No, I do think that there will be a smaller number of winners. I think that I'm probably more with. I thought Simon said a couple of things with which I really agreed. First, I think there's an importance to differentiate between digitization and tokenization. And I think actually tokenization is a bit of an unfortunate term for what we're doing, at least in the regulated securities markets, where I think what we're really creating are uncertificated securities. And if we begin thinking about it that way, I think it will be a little bit easier to fit within the existing regulatory frameworks, which is one of the obstacles. But the part that I really wanted to touch on was that I think Simon's point that where the real power of this comes is in middle and back office efficiencies, the elimination of reconciliations, making things work better. It does not magically democratize, in my mind, and it does not magically solve liquidity issues. In fact, I think liquidity is the biggest barrier to adoption, because liquidity is not a technology problem. Liquidity is a how many buyers and sellers you have in the market on a given day problem. And if you have a fragmented set of blockchains, you're going to fragment the liquidity, and you're going to exacerbate what I think is one of the major obstacles to roll out an adoption. It is very hard to get an issuer to originate a 7-year security, for example, where they want to be assured of a secondary market onto a new blockchain where there's not necessarily wide adoption. So I do think that liquidity aggregating along a certain set of protocols makes a heck of a lot more sense than fragmented protocols. And I also think that interoperability, which is what we talk about typically to address that issue of fragmentation, is not really feasible in the broad sense. I think that too is a somewhat imperfect term that should really be thought of as portability. Like it would be possible to move from one blockchain to another, just like you can move from DTC to Euroclear, for example, but that's different from true interoperability. And that creates inefficiencies when you've got to transit from one platform to another. So I do think that ultimately the number one issue for the markets is going to be how much liquidity you get, and the technology should be an enabler of that liquidity. It should not be a drag on that liquidity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you've raised liquidity, because it's clearly a very important issue. But I'd like to just stay with the primary market for a little bit. And Richard, perhaps you could help us. What's going to, you've heard Damien describe what type of issuers we're going to get, and Simon and Michael both talked about the type of issuers we're likely to get from a conventional point of view. But how are we going to make this happen? How are we going to get issuers to come to market, and how are we going to get investors to invest in these asset classes? And I'm thinking of quite basic questions like who's actually going to do the work of designing these issues? In the conventional markets, we have investment banks who do all that work, and that's complex, difficult work involving expenditure of a great deal of money. Often that role is kind of forgotten here. Somebody has to do the work of designing what the structure of the issue is going to be, for example. And how important a role is that in the primary market, the role of the investment bank?
I think it probably comes off the comments that Michael was making, which is we're seeing a lot of the efficiency plays in the middle and back office. And actually tokenization and tokens is usually a misnomer here. We tend not to use the word security tokens, we use the word digital securities, and we're picking up the same stick, but from different ends. Mm-hmm. If we look at the corporate issuers, so large-scale corporate issuers, and Switzerland's a really good market. A small number of very household name issuers out there, but those issuers had huge drags of cost. That means that the deal size has to be huge, and actually there's only a small number of deal makers in that market. What you've seen over the last 5 years is an explosion of issuers, and that's not tokenization. It's not a blockchain distributed ledger. It's simply that the black magic of doing things like securitization or the creation of these issuances has now become commodity. And so the actual cost of doing an issuance is now an order of magnitude cheaper. And therefore, a huge number of new entrants have come into the market, recognizing that there isn't a magic here. You don't need to be a Credit Suisse. You don't need to be a UBS. And actually, Switzerland's seen, and they are a market leader in this, seen an explosion of issuers. So we're already seeing a creation of these brand new digital asset or digital security issuers coming into the market. They will create FOMO as soon as they start picking up bigger and bigger deals. The larger established issuers, the Credit Suisses and the UBSs, will start to take interest. So it is a matter of starting small, growing as everyone starts, and very quickly you will get noticed.
Yes, I agree with Richard's comments. I mean, it's starting small and growing in interest. On Tokenised side, we see a lot of interest in real estate projects, in private equity projects, either to tokenize existing cap table or to raise fund from the very beginning. But we are seeing more institutional adoptions. Many projects of issuing corporate debt. We're also involved in project for a commercial bank digital currency. So that will facilitate the delivery versus payment on chain, which is at the moment missing or could be done using stable coins. So we're seeing the start of institutional adoption. But as for infrastructure change, you need all the elements in the chain to move at the same time. So of course, you're going to start with small projects involving a private issuer of securities with a small pool of investors, and then things will grow. You will see more investors, wider pool of investors, then bigger projects. And then as things mature, as the pure marketing aspect of it goes into the public, you will see more established players entering the game and benefiting from the efficiencies in operational terms that come with using digitized securities.
I think also there's a sort of an educational element to this as well. I mean, certainly, my background is in traditional financial markets, and when I meet sort of former colleagues and peers from that world and talk to them about crypto in its broadest sense, I mean, the first thing they think is Bitcoin, drug dealers, money laundering. There's a very blinkered view, and it's not. They just haven't been exposed to what the potential of blockchain and tokenization and everything else. But if you take the time to explain digitization, security tokens, digital securities, and all these things to them, then people get it. So it's not that they, it's just that they're misinformed at the minute or ill-informed, and actually when you explain it to them, they get it. So there is a huge education that needs to take place, which is why things like this are really important, but which will help fuel this adoption and, you know, and drive the sort of the institutionalized, you know, getting the institutions involved and sort of push things and build momentum further.
I was going to pick up on something Damien said though too about the asset classes, because it does I think it's not only size starting smaller and getting bigger, but it's also where things are, where there's not a robust infrastructure already in place today. So I think one of the challenges with, let's say, securities, where the market does work, and there are issues that we saw with GameStop that we're talking about now and the kinds of settlement lags that you get in the back offices, but it works. We settle $2 quadrillion worth of assets a year, and or DTC does, and they do it pretty efficiently. So I think in things like real estate and private equity, where you don't have that kind of a deep liquid market, and where there's also, like in many cases, let's say private equity, there are transfer restrictions and there are perhaps additional administrative burdens. Same with real estate. I think that's where it's going to get its toehold first, and the reason being both, it's more broke. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it's certainly more broke in some of these other categories where there's not a robust infrastructure, number one. And number two, there's often more complexity around the operational side that can deliver added value.
Yeah, I think I'd add on that when you look at those processes, there's a mandatory push at the moment. Now, as a financial services companies, we never do too well when things are discretionary. If it's discretionary, we're all sitting there with the book of work, wondering when are we going to do stuff? Should we do it now? Should we do it later? And trying to get several banks to do the things together to collaborate, because I've not yet met a trade that can be settled by one party on its own. We have to do this collaboration, whether it's pre-trade, primary, or post-trade. I think we will get most drive out of things that could be mandatory. And some of those asset classes that we've been talking about are things that I think will be affected with some of the Basel IV regulations that are going to affect the bank's balance sheets. So the banks will not be able to do the same things with their balance sheets they've done before. They need to stop assets getting on there in the first place, and they need to stop, they need to get some of them off that balance sheet. They don't have to do it by tokenization, but they may very well do if we can find efficient routes to that. So I think that's where the push comes. So I'm kind of with Mike on where's stuff likely to come from.
Actually, Love, I was going to ask you to expand on that. You'd said earlier that Basel IV might be a driver of this. Banks getting things off of their balance sheet would strike me at first to be kind of orthogonal to tokenization. You can bring private capital in. Shadow banking is the story of the last 10, 15, 20 years. Can you elaborate on why tokenization drives that?
No, I think tokenization, it could drive tokenization rather than the other way around. So okay. You're quite right. Faced with a problem, you can deal with it on paper. I mean, a great example, not far from where I'm sitting in Zurich right now, 2008, UBS had a crisis and they dumped a whole load of assets on the Swiss National Bank. As a package deal, that transaction didn't do anything for the secondary market. It was just a necessary evil transaction thing that got done. It didn't make those assets any more available to retail investors or anything else. So I think the attraction here is that we have a chance to use the new technology to do things in a way that deals with the matter at hand, the mandatory, get things off the balance sheet, and you get opportunity on the other side. And we've had a global bank come to us in the last 6 weeks saying, yeah, we'd like to be able to take this real estate and put it with our wealth business, which makes sense for them. They could do it as a one-time exercise, but that doesn't really help liquidity and all the rest. And so those private investors may demand a higher premium for holding those assets. And so the tokenization bit just says, yeah, you got a chance to do better here.
Yeah, I like this idea of, was one of the questions we're always asking is where the issue is going to come from. And if banks are looking to dispose of assets off their balance sheet, tokenization is one way to do it. So that's interesting. Now, Michael Shorthoff, could I just, before we leave the primary markets, could I just ask you a question, which is this? Simon spoke very eloquently about the need to educate people. And I sometimes worry that all of us kind of approach this with our old mindsets on, because that's the security markets we used to know and that we understand. Are, for example, people who are looking to design token issues or looking to issue tokens, looking, for example, at composability in the DeFi markets? You can put together all these different bits, even temporarily, sometimes not even permanently, to create a really interesting on-the-fly type of token. Do you think that people are looking at that for security tokens, or is that just too unusual, should we say, for security markets?
I think so. Personally, for me, I think that those two things are fairly well aligned. But in reality, I think that most of the education right now for people that are actually coming from traditional space, that education is mostly just to wrap their head around some very basic things around the DeFi space, right? Just to explain people how Compound, which is, I think, sort of the most well-known and well-used protocol on DeFi, just to explain people how that works and how come you have interest rates that fluctuate every 15 seconds. That as itself is sort of like mind-blowing for them. Having said that, I think that look at the end of the day, when you look at some of the tokenization or issuance platforms out there, right? They do tokenize or issue the security tokens on standards that are compatible with ERC-20s, that are compatible with how DeFi works today. And there is no reason not to basically use the same mechanisms. Is it something that people are thinking about right now? Honestly, I don't have that many of those conversations. I think that those conversations will come in at the point in time where we will see an uptake, right? When the market will actually be much more active, hopefully, in the next 12, 18 months. And then I think those conversations, then basically people will rush into that part of the market as well. As an example, I can give a slightly different example, which is NFT. NFT was a dormant space for quite a few years. It's not a new concept. People think that it's a new concept. It's a concept that was out there probably since 2015, 2016. In some ways, it is a concept that is related to when you think about a real estate token. One way to look at it is, it's a type of NFT, right? Assuming that it's non-fungible. Once we basically start to see that part of the market picking up, we actually started to see also DeFi projects that are basically directly addressing that part of the market, right? So I think that this will happen. When it will happen, we will have enough liquidity and the market and the market cap of security tokens will be large enough.
Right, we're starting to get questions in now, and they're focused interestingly on the middle and back office. But before we come to those, I'd like to pick up Mike Manning's point about liquidity, because this is the great unknown, which is how are these security token markets going to create liquidity? Do we need market makers, as we have in DeFi? We have these automated market makers, we have these algorithmic lenders. So to some extent, DeFi is starting to pioneer how that problem is solved. But even the old illiquid equity markets used to have lead brokers. Sometimes the broker would step in if there was no counterparty to a trade, just because they had brought it to market and felt they had some responsibility to keep it liquid. Demi, are you still there somewhere? I wondered if
yes. I mean, from our experience with our clients, the issuance and the number of investors is still limited at this stage. So we don't foresee market makers appearing to provide extra liquidity than what is happening right now. You have to keep in mind that here we're dealing with private markets. So as such, liquidity is scarce. What you will find is people willing to buy and sell private shares or private debt on occasional basis. And to support that, what we have decided to release at the end of last month was a bulletin board, which is not a regulated trading venues, but it's a space where buyers and sellers of private securities security tokens in our case, can publish ads stating their intention to buy and sell in broad manners. And then they can be contacted by a counterparty, and then the two can negotiate and execute outside of the platform. So it's not trading as public securities, it's a proxy, but I think it's the first step to enable counterparty discovery, to enhance liquidity in a certain way in order to help people acquiring or leaving positions in private markets. Some time ago, a practitioner told me that dealing in private securities it takes 9 months. It's almost a pregnancy sometimes on certain asset classes to find a counterparty, to negotiate the terms. You have sometimes some conditions like right of first refusals that make this asset not as liquid as you wish them to be. There are some conditions to get into the companies. So that's why liquidity is sometimes difficult. You also have to take into account that some conditions have to be met in order for you to invest in the company. And that's why we provide a security token with our standard TRX token, which has embedded compliance, which ensures for the issuers that all its investors are compliant, and if some restrictions are imposed from the get-go, these are being processed and respected in secondary market trading. So I think liquidity and trading for private securities is something that could happen, but that's not the majority for the market.
Now, there's a question from Chris Caruso here. Can security token settlement gain widespread adoption, i.e. critical mass, without the major banks and clearing corporations? Interesting, he brings up the clearing houses. Now, can this adoption happen without regulatory pressure? Does regulatory pressure come only when they see the significant benefits and risk reduction of digitizing the post-settlement process, e.g. the GameStop, Robinhood issue? So there's a couple of things in there. Can this happen without the counterparty credit risk issue being solved? And secondly, can it happen without explicit regulatory, Chris uses the word pressure, but let's imagine we have a regulatory framework which everybody agrees, can this happen without that? Mm-hmm. Mike, you look as though you're poised to give us a view.
Yeah, no, I spent a lot of time thinking about this because we've spent a lot of time working with the SEC on these issues. And I guess, first of all, I think you're right. I look at it as the regulation is not so much about creating pressure to adopt, it's about ensuring that it's not an obstacle to adoption. And the key issue here, I think, is back to the topic we touched on at the beginning, and I'd very much echo, it sounds like Richard and I are on the same page, that I think this is where this concept of security token is unfortunate. It gets in the way of understanding for both regulators and investors what's happening on. What we're really doing is we're creating securities. Security token is, I think, an artifact of the ICO boom, where people were trying to erase the difference or conflate a utility token, something used for execution on a platform, with a financial asset, something that was designed for capital markets appreciation or asset appreciation. And when the SEC and other regulators stepped in and said, no, these are unregulated securities, treat them as securities, we abstracted out this concept of a token to create a security token. But what we really should have done is let go of the token concept and just say it's a security. And the reason I make that point is that, again, what we're doing is we're issuing uncertificated securities, which means that the beneficial ownership of the investor is defined on the register maintained by the registrar, which can either be the issuer or a third party like a transfer agent. That's simple. It's a book entry, uncertificated security offering. We know how to deal with that, and markets know how to think about that. And there's a very robust regulatory framework defining what that looks like and what needs to be done. We don't really know what a token is in a financial market sense. This is a new thing in the world. And so I think that it's a subtle difference, but when you come at it with the lens of I'm moving tokens around, you're really closer to a world of share certificates, which is very much what we're getting away from. We don't have certificates. We don't have a thing that represents your interest that's tokenized. We have your interest itself, which is maintained on a share register. And I think the other part of Chris's question that I saw in the Q&A was that, well, what does this mean if you've got a register? Does this mean everybody's ownership is public? And do you therefore need some kind of a CSD in the process to maintain that secretly? And the answer to that, I think, is no. But the crux move, the thing that is extremely hard in blockchain for capital markets, is this privacy layer. You know, the blockchains like Ethereum or Bitcoin, of course, have no privacy layer, and that doesn't work for finance. And so one of the reasons we created our own blockchain at Assembly is that you really do need to be able to layer that privacy or confidentiality, or put that privacy or confidentiality layer on top. You can still have data on a ledger that is widely distributed if you encrypt it properly, such that you only allow access to certain players. So I don't think you need a CSD to do that, but you do, I think, need to embrace the concept of uncertificated securities with a registrar, and that can get increasingly abstracted even into possibly a smart contract, although in today's world, it should be an entity. It's easier for people to wrap their heads around if there's an entity who's performing that role on the system. And that's, I think, what you need. And furthermore, once you adopt that framework, I don't think you need new regulation. I think that if you execute correctly, you can live very much within the regulatory framework that in many ways predated the creation of the CSDs, where you didn't have this concept of a separation of registered ownership from nominee ownership, i.e. the custodians, from beneficial ownership. And we can return to a world in which the ownership interest of the investor is represented directly on the register. The investor maintains a property right interest, and you solve a lot of the problems that emerged with the creation of the indirect nominee system.
Thanks, Mike.
Hey, could I pick up just on, just pick on what Mike was saying there, because, totally agree that in essence, we're just creating securities, and securities are very well and clearly regulated. However, I guess, a blockchain purist would say, yeah, but, with tokens and everything on blockchains, we don't need all this regulation. We don't need all these counterparties. We don't need, a lot of the infrastructure that is there today. And, maybe that will happen one day, but it's certainly not going to happen overnight. Things move slowly in capital markets. Excuse me, particularly around regulation. But it can happen in stages, and here, at Archax, we're launching a sort of a full-blown regulated market for digital securities, and for us, we're providing the custody too. So on the custody side, we can see who owns the tokens. On the deal side, and we can see who has money in their account on the fiat side, and the settlement is instantaneous on our exchange. So we don't need clearing houses involved, because it's sort of almost atomic settlement. I mean, not quite atomic, but it's instantaneous. Regulations mandate that we do have to use a CSD. So in the UK, so we have to be connected into Euroclear and Crest. But in essence, there's no traffic between the two. It's all sort of taking place within the Archax ecosystem, and we have control. And I guess this is an example of it's one step on the way to a new nirvana, maybe in time, but it's not going to happen overnight. And regulation has to move slowly forward and adapt as to realize some of the benefits that the technology can deliver.
Okay, so I'm just making sure I understood what you said there. You have to appoint Euroclear and Clearstream, but you don't actually need them. The work that they do, protecting the integrity of the issue, being the place where the tokens, or in this case, are issued, doing the settlement, actually you don't actually need them for that, not even as a node on a network.
Well, you have to have them because regulation says they have to be there.
You don't need them. You don't need them practically. That's what I mean.
Well, the only, the ultimate registrar record of ownership, of legal ownership, is there, but the beneficial owners are all held, in our case, within our nominee structure within our custody service. However, the CSDs do get involved. For example, with corporate actions, if dividends are distributed, they tend to be done through the CSD, or using the information that's in the CSD, so that there is sometimes some activity, but it's not used in the same way as it might do on a traditional exchange. But that's because day one we're offering a fully funded service, so we can see who has the inventory and we can see who has the money, and it's effectively a book entry swap in a way.
Okay, but I assume that creates some liquidity costs as well. But we'll maybe come back to that. Well, I'm glad you brought up CSDs, because Deng Chung Lu has asked a question here about CSDs on a token platform. He says, when a CSD uses a security token or tokenized securities, the securities ledger will be kept decentralized, let's say at the CSD and at custodian banks. But because of privacy, the customer's information at one custodian can't be saved to another custodian. So actually the ledger can only be saved in a small number of nodes, and those nodes may be fully under CSD control. What do you think is the solution for a ledger to be kept totally decentralized? What he's saying is that we've always assumed up to this
I
point.
can comment on that one, Dominic.
Yep.
Happy to. So you'll recognize that what's going on here is there's a technology that has come out, and one of its greatest features is transparency, which has allowed us to trust some of the digital currencies and then tokens that have been formed on it. But as the question is asked, if you then apply that technology to a market where you do want privacy between the actors from the point of view of commercial or regulatory constraints, then that technology doesn't fit. So there is currently a debate going on, should we change the regulatory rule book to meet the technology features, or should we change the technology to meet the regulatory features? Now, anybody that's been in this environment for long enough knows that it's a hell of a lot easier to change the technology than it is to change the rule book. So although we are seeing some regulators recognizing that they have over-centralized, you've seen the Hong Kong, Swiss, and now the Germans move their regulatory, and others are moving in place to start uncentralizing it. Simon's brought up the fact that he doesn't actually need a CSD, but he's required to have a CSD. Some of that is being taken out of the rule book, but don't think for one moment that we're going to change the rule book so that it fits a specific technology that allows anonymity or transparency around the transactions. The reason you're seeing different technologies coming into this space that do have privacy and do conform to AML, CTF regs is because they know full well that those regs are not going away. Even if it isn't regs, it's commercial desire not to see everybody else's transactions or not to see the ownership across the entire network. So I think you've got a long way to go before we get to a position where we have a technology such as ETH 2.0 or Corda, which you can see are now starting to bake in the features that are required to meet the rule book, rather than hoping the rule book will change for you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that was. Go ahead, Michael.
Michael, go ahead.
I think that this point is actually brought up quite a lot around the fact that the question around the privacy. And I think that there is some kind of misconception that basically was created over time because of the sort of idea that there is the world of private blockchains that were designed with the idea of built-in privacy and are applicable directly for security, tokenized security or digital securities. And then there is the wild west of the Bitcoins and the Ethereum on the public blockchain where everything is transparent. Well, this is in generally it is true, especially on Ethereum. We've seen over the last couple of years, but predominantly over the last year or so, we've seen actually projects that basically bring zero knowledge proofs and layers that actually allow you to do full anonymity on public blockchains without actually disclosing that information. So to the question that was asked, I think that it's actually feasible. There are still questions over there around scaling, and there are still questions over there around cost, because some of those solutions are currently operating at a fairly high cost on public blockchains, but they do solve the issue of privacy that is inherent in the traditional market, and how put aside the regulation, really how businesses want to and the commercial interest should be reflected, right? So I think that the technology is definitely there, and honestly, I think that if we want to see a world where it's actually a much more open ecosystem, where we will see a lot of participants coming in and are capable of doing those transactions and essentially increasing the liquidity, integration of closed systems is much more difficult than basically integration of some of those open systems. So I think that most of the effort, if we really want to make it make this happen, and the privacy is a requirement, is to figure out how to do it on the public blockchains.
Now, we asked a couple of questions about the Binance offering zero fee trading of stock tokens, Tesla. Do we have any views on it? This is Eugene Kent. Do we have any views or opinions on the Binance announcement to offer new tokenized stock trading service in Tesla? Now, this prompts a bigger question. You might have some specific observations on that, Simon, Damien, Olaf, but it prompts a bigger question about what's the revenue model for the sort of platforms you're building? Are you going to charge listing fees? You're going to have company announcements. I'm thinking the way stock exchanges make money here. Are you going to sell price information? You're going to develop indices. You're going to develop derivative products. Are you going to get paid for settlement? Are you going to take transaction fees? Are you going to charge custody fees? Will they be ad valorem, for example? Will you develop whole new products like KYC, AML, CFT, onboarding services? Will you develop digital identities? What's the business model, Damien? How is Tokeny going to make money?
We have a very simple model by which we charge the issuer of security token. We charge on a token basis, and we have a setup fee and then a running fee. So the setup fee will include the definition of the security token, the compliance rules I mentioned earlier, in order to define the rules of transfer in the security token in the secondary market, and then a servicing fee, which will allow issuers, agents of the issuer, and investors to see and manage their tokens. So they can do this through interfaces we provide in white label, or directly connecting to the APIs, and then they can integrate their front end on the back of this. So we do not charge according to AUMs of number of investors, but really on a pure token basis. And of course, we want to enrich this offering with additional services we're going to develop in the future. I mentioned the bulletin board and other services in order to facilitate liquidity for issuers, and also enable issuers to perform more and more corporate actions using our platform.
Do you have a view on the Binance Tesla announcement?
This would be for public securities, so I wouldn't comment on that. We really focus on private securities on our side.
Yeah, it feels to me when I look at what they're doing, it's a version of the ADR that they're doing. They're just saying, hey, we're Binance, we've got an exchange, and we'll trade this thing. What you've got to remember, if you trade the tokenized product on Binance, is your issuer risk is Binance. It's not Tesla. It's not Bank of New York as an ADR agent that's regulated. It's Binance. History has taught me that lots of people don't understand issuer risk. Again and again. Yeah, Simon. Don't choke, Simon.
Yeah, I agree. Now, I think also, one has to question whether what they're doing is a regulated activity or not. I'm pretty sure it would be in the UK, but that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
But to pick up, Dominic, your question about revenue models, I mean, and to answer it from our perspective, I mean, we see, firstly, a lot of the companies that come to us because they're interested in listing on a sort of regulated secondary market actually need to raise money first. They're kind of early stage businesses and they want to raise money first. So, we've actually ended up moving into that area. So, we're now helping firms raise money, and that is a potential revenue stream in terms of success fees. So that's kind of one sort of revenue stream that we have. Additionally, we do charge a listing fee, and for people to be on the exchange, and we do charge trading fees for people to trade. And
another attendee has asked what is the roadmap from deferred settlement to atomic synchronized settlement. And I guess what he has in mind here is that the process you described a few minutes ago is really a fully funded one. You've got to have the stock and the cash there in order to do this instantaneous settlement. And this has been one of the major obstacles to the growth of these blockchain networks, because you have to come off the network for the cash leg if you want to get into fiat currency. Otherwise, you have to do it with payment tokens. Is there a clear path, and does it run through CBDC?
Yeah, I think like I said earlier, there's huge potential with the technology the underlying technology to do, to end up with things like atomic settlement potentially. But, but there's quite a journey to get there. I mean, I mentioned that, we offer a sort of fully funded solution, which means settlement can be instantaneous. And you don't really need a CSD, but actually that's just stage one for us. I mean, I think, in time that will change and people will trade on markets, on margin and in other ways, and you don't necessarily want a fully funded model all the time. And you also want to be able to trade on, have listings on multiple exchanges around the world. You want to be able to sort of move things around. And ultimately, the CSD in a regulated world could be a facilitator of managing that, controlling that, and providing interoperability between different blockchains, for example. So the advent of a blockchain-based CSD that is blockchain agnostic as well as being blockchain built is really quite interesting in allowing digital securities and security tokens to realize their full potential.
Yeah, I'm with that. I don't think there's one model. I can think of one great use case for doing instant settlement, which is if you could do PVP cross-border. Now, if you're a Swiss bank and you want to sell Swiss, buy dollar and settle trades, you can't do that right now without settlement risk. You can't do it. So we haven't got a global collateral pool. We haven't really got a single pool of liquidity. There, that makes sense. At the other end of it, I'm with Simon. Lots of people can come along and say, look, I want to trade. I'll settle at the end of the day, but I want to trade. And therefore, there's some risk management process during the day, call it a CCP, call it whatever, that makes sure that you deal with, at least with the variation margin and mark-to-market risk that's in there. But I don't think everything goes to T0. That said, I think the market has massively underestimated the benefit of shortening the settlement cycle, massively. We did a little bit of work when I was working with analysis, and we found out that across 15 large institutions, the counterpart and credit risk, if you moved it by 1%, 1% would save you $300 million each on average in risk-weighted assets. Take a 10% cost of capital, every 1% is 300 million. Those liquidity costs we underestimate. So shortening good, everything instant, probably not necessary.
While I've got your attention, Olaf, Teddy's asked this question: is Project Helvetica's proof of concept number 2 the best solution, where you split the securities leg from the payments leg, cash is settled through the convention? That's what we were just talking about, right?
Yep. This is, I think that the question comes up is, where are the securities and where's the means of payment? So we've had in Switzerland for years, the securities are in the CSD and the payment is in the real-time gross settlement system, Swiss interbank clearing, and that's worked. There are different arguments for having everything on one chain and having them on different chains. I'll give you my view, which is not necessarily that of SDX. I think as we end up with multiple new platforms, and Simon might be doing something in London and wants some Swiss francs to settle something, and Damien could be doing something in Luxembourg where the client wants to settle in Swiss francs. If the assets and the payment are too tightly coupled, we end up with a bunch of Euroclears. Mm-hmm. And that's the model we've had for ages. It fragments liquidity. It is frighteningly expensive, all that liquidity. Never mind what I just talked about on settlement cycles. The cost of intraday liquidity buffers is absurdly high. You could not sack enough people in India or outsource anything to make up for those costs. So I think the better job we do in the long run, and nothing to do with Project Helvetica, the better job we do in the long run of taking the securities asset and the payments asset apart and making the payment asset available to as many processes as possible, the better that will be for everybody.
We had a question here: what's the future for stock lending and borrowing in a tokenized world? I guess we're seeing a glimpse of the future of that in the DeFi space, are we not, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now in the DeFi space, the lending and borrowing is has to be over collateralized, right? Because it's an anonymized system, right? So there is no identity, there is no credit. Unlikely that will work for I think for security tokens and or for tokenized security, as you can see the market right now. There are quite a few interesting projects right now in the DeFi space that are basically trying to bake identity into the protocol and basically create a more institutionalized version where you can actually allocate credit, and then I think we can actually see a much more interesting lending and borrowing market around those security tokens that will probably be aligned with capital requirement, with the capital efficiency that we currently seeing in the traditional space.
Yeah, I would sort of agree with exactly what Michael was saying there. I think it's interesting also, you kind of see what's happening in DeFi, but actually if you, and this is something we're looking at, if you kind of create a regulated DeFi environment where you're sort of taking the benefits of what's being pioneered in the DeFi space, but operate them in a regulated way. I mean, for things like stock lending, staking and the like, leveraging the capabilities of smart contracts, for example, is really quite interesting, sort of automating aspects, but doing it within the confines of a regulated walled garden is a really interesting evolution, I think, of what's happening, what's being pioneered in DeFi.
Picking up on that point, Dominic, Simon's coming in from a regulated perspective. He's a regulated institution, one that's taken an MTF license, but is a new kid on the block. Therefore is able to adapt and move as they wish to grow, while going on in the crypto space, being dragged down by the fact that they have anonymity and struggle to meet the regulation, but they are a hotbed of innovation. They are starting to take regulation and accept regulation isn't going to change for them. And as these two worlds collide, you're going to see both sides, the incumbent financial institutions, even the disruptors, the new ones like Archax, pull in the innovation across from the crypto side as you're watching the crypto institutions take regulation and attempt to try and trade regulated entities, regulated instruments. Look at Binance trying to trade Tesla. And as these two merge, you're not going to notice the difference. You've always heard me talk about Animal Farm, the last line being that the creatures look from pig to man and back from man to pig and pig to man. You can't see the difference, and you won't see the difference between these institutions over time. It is just going to merge into one.
I like the Orwell quote. I'm going to use that.
Here's a question from Magnus Almquist, who says, I would argue that CCP in custody adds trust to a market, which is especially important when offering new types of instruments to a market, such as tokens. So what is the view of the panel of using and introducing CCPs, central counterparty clearinghouses? Now, we've already said we don't need them, but Mike, do you have a view on whether these institutions have a valid role to play in the development of tokenization markets, or what you've called unsecreted securities markets?
Right. Well, no, I think that one thing to recognize about CCPs is they actually they do add an element of risk as well as detract an element of risk. And I think that we can achieve the risk mitigation in a peer-to-peer way without introducing the risk that you get with a CCP. So there's a lot of regulation has driven more and more assets onto CCPs. CCPs do not fail very often, but when they do fail, it's a really, really big deal. It is a massive point of centralization. And so what they certainly solve for is counterparty risk, because the CCP steps in, novates the trade, and takes the risk in the middle. However, if you back to the conversation earlier about margining, which I think is very significant, and variation margin that Olaf had mentioned, there are ways to achieve a lot of that risk reduction in a peer-to-peer way. So one of the things that we've got going, working with a number of institutions on is, including Vanguard and State Street and others, is we've developed an OTC derivatives application where you can automate the calculation of variation margin throughout the day and post multiple times a day. So today, typically that's calculated once. There are reconciliation issues, and then the delivery of the the collateral, the variation margin against the risk, can happen a day later. So you might be 24 to 48 hours out, which creates obviously increased counterparty risk, and why CCPs are great to step in. But if you can do that calculation every 15 minutes and post consistently, you can, in a bilateral way, eliminate the counterparty risk across the two parties without needing to go to a CCP and without having that very much larger centralized entity there. Now that does create, to the point that I think Simon and Dominic and Olaf were all raising, this question of efficiency, because there is a benefit to netting. And so if you're instantly settling everything atomically, you might end up with more capital. However, in especially the case of variation margin, if you're reducing the amount of time that you're out, you're reducing the level of volatility and amount of capital. So I think there are ways to achieve, I mean, I'm not saying never use a CCP, but I do think that a lot of you've seen a dramatic increase in CCP share of a lot of these derivatives trades. And I think that's not necessarily risk reducing for the market as a whole. And we could take much of that and put it back to peer-to-peer without increasing risk and possibly decreasing it a lot.
Yeah, we'd need some of that for anonymity, of course, though. In the OTC market, it's fine. Michael and I traded together because we thought it was a good idea. And so the anonymity doesn't come into it. But if you do want anonymity in a fast-moving securities trading environment, then you might end up with that CCP structure.
Well, but you can achieve anonymity without a CCP, right? I mean, you could have like a broker-dealer acting in an agent role could provide anonymity without having to go to a CCP, right?
Yeah, that's another possible solution.
Now, Magnus has added, yes, exactly. So how do we live in a mixed near real-time settlement and T+2 or T+1 settlement timetable in the same securities, which he brings up a very large point here, which is about interoperability. And I'm conscious here our time is kind of up, but this is quite a useful, an important subject on which to end, is that of interoperability, because liquidity, after all, is going to depend to some extent on the ability of different platforms, both established traditional exchanges and different types of blockchain-based tokenization platforms. They're going to have to interoperate. And we don't yet have the equivalent of SWIFT standards here. In fact, we have a sort of proliferation of different standards here. Maybe we don't need standards, I don't know. But Demir, perhaps you could give us some, and I think this needs to be our final question, perhaps you could give us some thoughts about how marketplaces like yours are going to interact with other marketplaces like yours, but also with traditional exchanges. What do we need to answer Magnus's question, really, which is liquidity?
Yes, I mean, I think for some time it has been mentioned earlier that there will be competing standards. I mean, we have put our protocols, TRX token for regulated exchange. It's a development of the ERC20 tokens. We operate on Ethereum public, and we have built compliance through our on-chain identity systems for issuers, agents of the issuers, and investors. So that allows us to implement compliance rules when it comes to transfer. So there are other standards out there, and then it's going to be competing standards. There could be bridges, but the technical challenges are high. And so we will see from the adoptions which are the winning standards. And that's what we're going to see in the coming years. When it comes to liquidity, as Mike mentioned earlier, it's really about how many buyers, how many sellers, total value of the assets, and the bid-offer spread. So it's a state of the market, and that will depend fundamentally on the type of assets that we're looking at. So in a nutshell, there will be competing standards, and we'll see what will be the most used and resilient blockchain for tokenized securities.
But your view is we need standards, Demi, is that right?
Yes, I mean, there are different protocols, there are different type of smart contracts, and interoperability is an objective, but technical realization of this interoperability between blockchain is a technical challenge.
Just as Dominic, just as you expect to be able to send text messages between different telephone networks. You and I are old enough to remember when text messages could only be sent to your friends that were on the same network. So that interoperability, and I think Michael's called it portability, is a much better word, where you're expecting portability. If you look at what the work we've done bringing to market the Dazzle crypto bridge, that portability between public Ethereum and public Corda is now out in the wild, allowing digital securities to move, or tokens of any digital asset sort, between these two networks, we are slowly breaking down that technical barrier. And as Michael says, some of that comes with a reduction in efficiency between the twos, and we are slowly working through that story.
But Richard, is technology an alternative to standards in the long run?
You tend to see an explosion of different technology solutions that then consolidate down to a standard. That might be a de facto one, or it may be a one provided to you by a regulator. We've had a number of standards in this space that over time have become the go-to. Certainly the world doesn't need 100 blockchains, but what we are seeing is a consolidation down to the point where we can actually get to a set of standards, and at that point the technology can conform to it or not, depending on what it's trying to do.
Michael Schorloff, perhaps a last word from you about on this question. The old joke about standards is the great thing about them is there's so many to choose from. That's an old securities market joke. Are we in danger of reproducing the same thing in the security token markets, or is there a technological fix to this which is not yet with us?
I think I tend to agree with Richard that at the end of the day we will see sort of consolidation into one or maybe a handful of blockchains, and we will see a consolidation into one or handful of probably formats, and that will basically just whether that will be sort of dictated by the regulators or that will be dictated by just a general adoption. I think it's going to be B, right? Because basically what's going to happen, in my view, is that we will see some big players move in, creates certain inventory, and that basically creates a network effect, right? Because people need to integrate into it, people want to participate in that market, so inherently they need to adopt that standard adopt that format, and that format becomes a standard. We've seen that we've seen it with ERC-20s, right? In the early days, there were multiple different type of contracts that were even representing tokens, and eventually things have just standardized on pretty much one implementation because just the entire marketplace supported it.
Simon,
yeah, I mean,
but can I to tell us how you're planning to interoperate with your
I had a couple of comments to make. I mean, at Archax, we're blockchain agnostic, so we're not kind of following any particular blockchain or protocol. We want to sort of allow people to use whichever they wish. But I think also it's interesting if you look at the traditional financial markets. I mean, there is a kind of a standard in FIX, the Financial Information Exchange Protocol. But actually, that's not plug and play. If you plug into a FIX network, you've got to understand how the other side have used it and the tag fields they've allocated and stuff. So it's not as simple as just plug and play. But also, I think it's interesting what's happening. I mean, the Fin P2P initiative, which I know a number of us on this call are part of, which is being sort of driven by Onera. What they're doing is primarily at the moment around in the private securities world, but allowing you to issue a token on one blockchain and settle it on another. So they're trying to insulate sort of the financial markets business world from the underlying technology, which I think is the way forward. We don't worry about TCP/IP when we use a browser. We don't care what underlying protocols we use when we send a mail message. We just use the technology without thinking about it. And I think that's the direction of travel that we'll get to. The success of blockchain and digitization and tokenization will be when we don't talk about it anymore. It's just the underlying technology that everyone's using because it's the most efficient, and we're just talking about the business case sitting on top of it.
Now we must stop in a minute, but I don't want to stop before at least putting to you the last questions have been raised by members of the audience. One from Desislav Danov is, how much can DeFi be used for insurance securitization? Difficult question that. I don't know whether anyone has a view on that or not, or is that one for another day?
Yeah, feels like something for another day.
Okay. So we'll deal with that another day. Come to our next RD. We're doing a lot of work on DeFi, so I think put that question to us again then. Magnus has pointed out that yes, but how do you remain anonymous? I think we did discuss that earlier, didn't we? But does anyone want to restate the case for how you can retain your anonymity in these private permissioned tokenization platforms? Demi?
If I could take just a crack at one half of that, and Michael, you might have the other view, is that we are a private permissioned blockchain, and there are a couple of reasons for that. But one of the major things that we set out to ensure was this privacy layer, which, as I said, is kind of the crux move in blockchain. And I'd be curious Michael's view on how close zero knowledge proofs are and things like that can achieve in a public world. And our view was you really did need to have a private permission blockchain to execute that, and we've chosen to execute it with a data model that ensures that consensus is achieved effectively on encrypted data. So the data that is distributed to all nodes is fully encrypted, and then we manage the decryption of that through, it's purely cryptographically based privacy solution, not a peer-to-peer trading, which has inconsistency across nodes, or enclave computing, which has significant technological challenges if you're using the SGX chip at this point still to achieve that. So it can be done. You have to, but that's a question again of where interoperability becomes challenging, because our model of an encrypted distributed ledger with what we call secure channels to decrypt to plain text state machines implies the way we execute transactions. And so back to the interoperability question, I think you can standardize on the data. What's the definition of an asset? But I think it's hard to standardize on the smart contract layer because it is so tied up in the transaction layer. That's how we've achieved it in our blockchain. But Michael mentioned if you're doing it in a public blockchain, there are very interesting things around, various types of cryptographic solutions there.
Yeah, there are quite a few strong teams that are working on it. There is the UI project Nightfall that is working on it. There is Starworks. There is a pretty serious group of cryptographers that build a zero knowledge proof layer for Ethereum that is currently in production, being used for sort of at the moment optimizing the fees over there. So I think that of course it's easier to solve this problem in a private blockchain, which you guys have done it, and clearly some of the other private blockchains have I think sort of led the way in terms of putting it out there. I think that there are already solutions in the public blockchains that can be used, but the main issue right now over there is actually sort of performance and fees, that those issues need to be solved as well. And then we can get into the right, I guess, performance point from anonymity, cost, and scalability, right? Which we are not there at the moment.
Just one last comment from a member of the audience. Philippe Van Heck says on Binance, it'd be interesting to know the legal nature of what you can actually trade on Binance and whether it is regulated. And I think you addressed that earlier, Olaf, when you said actually your real risk is on, we don't know about the regulatory status, but the real risk is on Binance itself, because it's like a DR was your...
Yes, it's absolutely a depository receipt. You're taking that risk. I would guess as soon as Binance start offering those kinds of products, that's going to attract the attention of the regulators. The CPMI, who opine on all of these things, have been pretty clear, particularly around Bitcoin and stable coins, and more generally around digital assets, which is same business, same risks, same regulation. So you can jump up and down as Binance all you like and say, oh, we're not regulated, blah, blah, blah. But if you start wrapping a listed stock into a new wrapper, I don't think that one's going to pass muster with the regulator who's going to give you a free pass. You're going to attract all the appropriate regulation that goes with it, would be my view.
Okay. We must stop in a minute, but I'd like to ask each of you one question, which I think is an important one. I can think of 50 others, which we're going to have to come back to this topic again and again, I think, over the next few months. But my question is this. I was amazed by how quickly we jumped into the operational side of this and the cost saving, if you like, the disintermediation, as we used to call it. So a large part of the promise of this tokenization, we're going to save a lot of money in the back and the middle office. Yet at the same time, I'm always reading about the price of gas. in DeFi, as you know, the transaction costs there seem to be actually remarkably high. And Michael referred earlier, of course, to 150% collateralization in the lending markets there as well. So whatever DeFi is doing, it hasn't solved the cost problem. My question is this: do we have concrete evidence that these savings can be made, especially the savings in reconciliation, by moving away from the way we do things now towards the tokenized or uncertificated securities market, which Mike, to use Mike's term? Do we have concrete evidence these savings are actually there, Olaf?
I think the benefits here come on the balance sheet side. So the benefits are less in the transaction processing costs. And by the way, reconciliation is not going away. We will have books and records with ledgers versus statements for a long time. The reconciliations might get easier, but I think all the benefit comes on the balance sheet side for the banks around some of the subjects we talked about: counterpart and credit risk, intraday liquidity buffers. Those are the really big numbers. And then getting that stuff off the balance sheet that they don't want there, and not having to use the balance sheet going forward. So for me, it's all about the balance sheet.
Daimler, do you agree with that? Is it all about the balance sheet and not about the transaction costs?
It is also about the transaction cost, and to support that we have had discussion with the investment banks that confirmed to us that debt issuance and structured product issuance as well, there can be some substantial savings when it comes to the life cycle of these securities. So they have quantified this, but they haven't publicized on the numbers. The issue here is really the adoption of all the elements in the chain, the distributors and the buyers using blockchain. So yes, there are some savings, but it's at the client's level. To the other question about the cost of transactions on blockchain, there are two elements here: the absolute price and also the variability of the price. It's hindering adoption, it's true, but you can have solutions through proxies or side chains that reduce drastically this issue of cost, and that we are looking at very closely at Tokeny, and we will communicate to clients as well. Some progress have been made and could solve this issue.
Thanks, Simon. Are these savings real or not?
Yeah. Well, a couple of comments there on the gas price side of things. I mean, it depends what blockchain you use, because that, some don't incur gas charges, and also, you look at an exchange like Binance. I mean, that's actually a central exchange, so all the trading is happening off chain anyway. But in terms of the savings in the traditional world, I mean, I think there have been various studies that have looked at it and sort of measured what they believe cost savings to be. But I guess the first-hand experience that I can bring is, we talk to all the big investment banks all the time about digitization and what we're up to at our checks, and I know for a fact that all of them have blockchain DLT teams looking at this space because they can see potential benefits from it. So exactly how it's all going to pan out and when things are going to happen and where cost savings will be made, I'm not sure, but it's definitely, that's the direction of travel.
Mm-hmm. Mike?
I think it's a really challenging question. And I think that I'm going to agree with Olaf that a lot of it is balance sheet and figuring out how to reduce balance sheet risk, because many of these costs that we talk about in transactions are really quite low. People talk about eliminating custodians for a while, which can't do for regulatory reasons, but more crucially, it's just not very expensive to be a custodian. It's a low cost system. So I think a lot of this does come in things like capital and reconciliation, which I do think will get less. But I've spent a lot of time really wondering about gas prices and things like that. I think the nature of the blockchain you're choosing is very important. A blockchain, especially proof of work blockchain, even proof of stake, has inefficiency built in on a tech side. And I mean, it's got to be expensive to solve a proof of work equation. That's what delivers the integrity. And so balancing that against the elimination of intermediaries, I think is going to be a real challenge. And I think there'll be some, implications for how we move going forward. Like you see Ether trying to move to, or Ethereum trying to move from proof of work to proof of stake. It's a challenging issue. There's not an easy answer to that, I don't think.
Michael, Mike brought up the question of custodians. They're being paid, or CSDs are being paid like half a basis point or 3/4 of a basis point these days. The savings probably aren't going to be that great. So where do you think the savings from moving to a tokenized market are going to be? Where are they going to come from?
I think that there will be two areas. One is basically moving the settlement and clearing and potentially even the trading to the edges, right? Well, once, by removing intermediaries. But I think most importantly is probably to be able to do things that it's not actually will be about saving. Maybe there will be saving, but I think it will be actually around things that we will be able to do that we cannot do at the moment, right? And I'm not sure that everything is in this space is really around saving. I think it's really around the fact that you essentially re-platforming into an infrastructure that over time will allow you to do things that you then create products that you cannot create with traditional assets because of how the ecosystem is structured.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. Last word from you, Richard. You've heard a range of views there about why this is worth doing. What, very succinctly as you can manage, is your perspective?
I think, Dominic, if you step back and recognize that the dematerialization of the public securities market is nearing completion, but the majority of the $6.5 trillion private securities market remains opaque, inefficient, illiquid. Actually, the efficiency plays that we are talking about here, the new revenue streams that people are interested in, is in that private securities space. And what we're looking to try and bring is those public security market benefits to the private securities market. So we won't start with the public securities. We've already been through that evolution. We've spent a phenomenal amount of money making price discovery in the public securities market efficient, but the private securities market is where the next wave of revenue and the next wave of efficiency. Some of the costing that we've seen is a 40% takeout on average of the cost of issuance, post-trade settlement, and asset servicing across the life cycle of that private security, where the majority of private securities today are either sitting in someone's inbox as a PDF certificate, and you've got to service that over its life cycle, try and secondary trade that, good luck, or it's sitting inside an electronic database inside the issuing platform. And we talk about gas being a problem, and yes, it is. You want to be very careful about which platform, be it one that is charging you gas or one that's charging you fees, that you end up on, because if you give them the keys to your kingdom, they're going to have pricing power over you.
Thank you, Richard. I think that is going to have to be our last word on this subject until we revisit it sometime very soon. I'd like to thank our panelists, Demi Afonso of Tokeny, Michael Scholler from Fireblocks, Mike Manning of Symbiont, Olaf Ransom of SDX, Richard Crook of Lab 577, and Simon Barmby from Archex. And thank you also to your audience, our audience, for your interest, especially your questions and your comments. Do keep asking them. Our next webinar is a couple of days away now on Thursday, the 15th of April, to our usual time of 1400 London time. Our subject is an intriguing one. The most innovative banks in the United Kingdom are not who you think they are. So you've heard of Starling, you've heard of Revolut and Monzo and the rest of them. We found some banks which are a lot more interesting than that. And I hope that a lot of you will join us on Thursday.
Thank you for joining us. You can find this discussion on www.futureoffinance.biz and indeed other planned webinars under current events. I am Wendy Gallagher. If you would like more information about how to work with us, please do email on wendy.gallagher@futureoffinance.biz. Thank you once again.